Hey everyone! Have you ever experienced something so terrifying that it stayed with you forever? Well, today, I'm taking you on a journey into the unknown. From eerie abandoned houses to haunted factories and mysterious churches, this video is packed with chilling stories that will keep you up at night. If you love spine-tingling tales, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Now, get ready, because this is going to be one eerie ride. Story 1, The Abandoned House in the Woods. I still don't know why I went into that house. I've always been into urban exploration, but there was something different about this one. It was buried deep in the woods, barely visible through the thick trees and vines that had wrapped around it like nature was trying to keep it hidden. People in town avoided talking about it, and when they did, it was always vague, just mutterings about an incident decades ago. No official records, no clear history. That should have been my first red flag. But instead, it only made me more curious. I took my camera, flashlight, and a crowbar, just in case, and I set out alone. The hike there was unsettling, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. When I finally saw the house, I hesitated. It looked wrong. The wood was blackened with age, the windows shattered, and the front door was slightly open, like it was waiting for me. Stepping inside, the air was thick, stale, like it hadn't been disturbed in years. My flashlight cut through the dust swirling in the air, revealing old furniture covered in sheets, faded wallpaper peeling from the walls, and a rotting staircase leading to the second floor. The house was big, bigger than I expected, and each room felt worse than the last, like someone had just left in a hurry, never looking back. Broken picture frames littered the floor, their glass crunching under my boots. I stopped at one and picked it up. The image was too faded to make out, but I could see the shape of people, maybe a family. Something about it made my skin crawl, so I put it down and moved on. Then, just as I was about to check the next room, I heard a deep, heavy thud coming from below, like something massive shifting beneath the floorboards. I froze. The sound was too deep, too deliberate to be the house settling. It came from directly beneath me, from what I assumed was a basement. My first instinct was to get out, but my curiosity won over just for a moment. I turned my flashlight toward the floor, looking for any gaps or a hatch. The boards were warped with age, some split open, just enough to see nothing but darkness below. I listened. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing, which suddenly felt too loud. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or something bigger, and forced myself to move. But as I stepped toward the next room, the thud came again, this time, louder, heavier. It wasn't random, it wasn't natural. It was as if something down there knew I was standing above it. That was enough. I turned back toward the door, deciding that whatever was in that house wasn't my problem. But the second I reached the entrance, my stomach dropped. The door where I had left it slightly open was now completely shut. I reached for the knob, my hands already clammy with sweat, and twisted. It didn't budge, not even a little. I pulled harder, yanking at it, but it was like the entire frame had shifted, sealing it shut. My heart started pounding. I hadn't heard it close. I hadn't heard anything move behind me. Every instinct in my body was screaming that I was no longer alone. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't explain. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my grip, scanning the room for any sign of movement. The house was silent, too silent. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. Maybe the wood had swollen from moisture. Maybe I had pulled it too hard, and it jammed. I tried to convince myself of anything logical, but my gut knew better. The air had shifted, like the house itself was aware of me. I turned back toward the room I had just come from, searching for another exit. The broken window. I had seen one in the living room earlier, shattered glass glinting in the dim light. If I could reach it, I could get out. But as I took my first step in that direction, the thud came again, this time right beneath my feet. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The sound was closer, more forceful, and it didn't feel like something knocking. It felt like something trying to get out. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The floor beneath me creaked, then let out a slow, groaning sound, like wood bending under pressure. And then I heard something worse, a dragging noise. Slow, deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across concrete. My breath caught in my throat. The basement. There was something down there, and it was moving. The idea of turning my back to it made my skin crawl. but I had no choice. I forced my legs to move, bolting toward the living room. My only thought being that I needed to get to that window before whatever was down there reached me. I practically threw myself into the living room, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I ran. The window was there, just like I remembered, jagged shards of glass still clinging to the frame. The outside world just a few feet away. But as I got closer, I felt it again, that shift in the air, that invisible pressure pressing down on my chest. It felt like stepping into a space that wasn't empty, like I had walked straight into something I couldn't see. My breath came in short gasps, my pulse hammering in my ears. I forced myself forward, reaching the window, ready to climb through. That's when I heard the first sound that wasn't coming from below. It was a creak, a slow, deliberate creak of wood bending under weight. But it wasn't behind. MIT was above me. My flashlight shot up toward the ceiling. The second floor was mostly open, with a rotted railing overlooking the living room. I scanned the darkness, my hands shaking, barely able to keep the beam steady. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, just as I was about to lower the light, something shifted in the shadows. A shape, faint, barely there, but unmistakable. It was standing just beyond the railing, as if watching me. My stomach twisted into knots. It wasn't moving. It wasn't reacting. It was just there. I couldn't breathe. My body refused to move, locked in place as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. The figure wasn't clear. It was just a shape, darker than the shadows around it, barely distinguishable. But I could feel it. That's what scared me the most. The pressure in the room intensified, like the air itself was pushing down on me, making it impossible to think straight. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs weren't responding. Then, just as I thought my body would betray me completely, the figure did something that made my blood turn to ice. It tilted its head. Not fast, not jerky, just a slow, unnatural tilt, like it was studying me. The moment it moved, my paralysis broke. I turned so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet, lunging for the window without caring about the shards of glass. I braced myself and shoved my body through, feeling the sharp sting as my arms scraped against the broken edges. I hit the ground outside hard, but I didn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, my flashlight slipping from my grip and disappearing into the weeds. I didn't care. I just ran. But as I reached the tree line, something happened that made me risk one last glance back. The house, something about it had changed. The second I turned back, I noticed the front door. It was wide open. Not just open, but swung fully outward, as if inviting me to come back. My chest tightened. I knew that door had been locked. I had yanked on it, pulled with everything I had, and it hadn't budged. Now it stood open like it had never been shut. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the figure. It was no longer on the second floor. It was standing in the doorway. I didn't wait to see what it would do. I tore through the woods, branches slashing at my arms, my legs burning as I ran harder than I ever had in my life. The house disappeared behind me, but I could still feel it, like the weight of its presence was pressing against my back. Then, just when I thought I had finally put distance between myself and whatever had been in there, flashing lights appeared through the trees. Police cars. I slowed, gasping for breath, my heart still hammering. They were pulling up to the house. I had no idea why, no idea who had called them. But as I stood there, watching from a distance, I felt something even worse than fear. I felt relief. Because whatever was in that house, it wasn't my problem anymore. I stayed hidden behind the trees, watching as the officers stepped out of their cars. There were 3 of them, moving cautiously toward the house, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I wanted to call out, to warn them, but I couldn't find my voice. I was still too shaken, still trying to convince myself that what I had seen was real. One officer reached the open doorway and paused. His light swept across the threshold, illuminating nothing but dust and decay. No figure, no movement, just an empty, rotting house. Then, something strange happened. The officer at the door hesitated, then turned to the others and shook his head. A brief exchange murmured words I couldn't make out tanned. Then they started heading back to their cars. My stomach twisted. They weren't going inside. They weren't investigating. It was like they already knew, like they had expected this. One of them spoke into his radio, giving some kind of confirmation. And just like that, they got into their vehicles. No urgency, no concern. The lights on their cars flickered off one by one, and within minutes, they were gone. The house stood there, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The police showing up out of nowhere was one thing, but the way they left so calmly, so unconcerned was what really unsettled me. It was like they had been there before, like they knew exactly what they would find. Nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Had they seen this before? Did they know what was in that house? Or worse, did they know and choose to ignore it? I felt sick. There was something bigger at play here, something I wasn't supposed to understand, and that terrified me more than anything. I forced myself to leave, stumbling back through the forest until I reached my car. I don't remember unlocking the door or starting the engine. All I remember is the way my hands trembled against the wheel as I sped away. I told myself I wouldn't look back, but I did, just for a second, and that was my mistake, because standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the glow of my taillights, was a shape, still silent, watching me. I don't know how long it had been there. I don't know if it had followed me. I only know that I never went near those woods again, and I never will. Story 2, the derelict factory and the stalker. Hey guys, I've been lurking on this forum for a while, but I've never had the guts to share my own story until now. This happened a few months back, and I still can't wrap my head around it. Me and 2 buddies from college, Jake and Saradis, decided to check out this old abandoned factory on the edge of town. We're all into urban exploring, you know, sneaking into creepy places just to feel the vibe. This place was massive, like something out of a nightmare. Rusted machines everywhere, broken windows letting in this grayish light, and a damp smell that stuck in your throat. It had been shut down for decades, and the whole area around it was dead quiet, just weeds and cracked pavement. I remember walking up to it that afternoon, feeling this weird chill, even though it wasn't that cold out. The plan was simple: poke around, take some pics, and get out before dark. I had no idea how bad it'd get. We stepped inside, and right away, it felt off, like the air was heavier somehow. The factory was a maze of huge metal pipes and conveyor belts, all covered in dust and grime, with shadows stretching out in every corner. Our footsteps echoed way too loud, bouncing off the walls like someone else was walking with us. I kept my phone light on, scanning the place, and noticed how the windows were so high up you couldn't see out, just these dark, empty rectangles staring down at us. Sarah was snapping pics, and Jake was ahead, poking at some old control panel. I decided to wander a bit on my own, just a few steps down this narrow hallway lined with rusted lockers. That's when I first heard a faint shuffle behind me. I turned, thinking it was Jake messing with me, but the hallway was empty. My stomach dropped a little, but I brushed it off as my imagination. Big mistake. I kept moving down that hallway, telling myself it was just the building settling or something. The lockers on either side were dented and peeling, some half open like they'd been abandoned mid-use. My light caught on little details: scratched graffiti, a faded work schedule pinned to a corkboard, stuff that made it feel frozen in time. But that shuffling sound came back, closer this time, like someone dragging their feet on the concrete. I spun around again, heart thudding, and called out, "Jake, Sarah." No answer, just this faint creak from somewhere deeper in the factory. I figured maybe it was them catching up, so I waited a sec, shining my light back the way I came. Nothing but shadows. Then, out of nowhere, a door at the end of the hall, the one I'd just passed, swung open a couple inches and stopped. I swear I didn't touch it. My mouth went dry, and I just stood there, staring, waiting for it to make sense. That's when I started feeling watched, like really watched. Not just the usual creepy vibes you get in a place like that, but this prickling on the back of my neck, like eyes were burning into me. I turned my light toward the door, and it creaked again, inching open a little more. I couldn't see anything behind it, just blackness, but I heard those footsteps again, slow and deliberate, coming from that direction. My legs felt like jelly, but I took a step closer, thinking maybe it was a rat or the wind or something dumb like that. Then the door slammed shut hard, like someone yanked it, and I jumped back so fast I nearly dropped my phone. My heart was hammering now, and I kept whispering to myself, "It's nothing, it's nothing," trying to stay calm. But deep down, I knew it wasn't nothing. Whatever was in that factory with us, it wasn't just old junk and echoes anymore. I bolted back toward where I'd left Jake and Sarah, my sneakers slapping against the concrete, every sound amplified in that hollow place. The hallway felt longer going back, like it was stretching out to keep me there. I could still feel that prickling on my neck, and every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something in the shadows. When I finally got to the main room, Jake was still messing with that control panel, and Sarah was crouched down, looking at some old tools scattered on the floor. I tried to play it cool, just said, "Hey, you guys hear anything weird?" They both looked up, shook their heads, and Sarah laughed, saying I was just spooked. I forced a smile, but my hands were shaking. I didn't want to sound crazy, so I kept quiet about the door and the footsteps. Figured maybe I was overreacting. But then it got worse. We decided to head deeper into the factory, toward this big open area with towering machines that looked like metal skeletons. The air was colder there, and this faint humming started like machinery was still running, even though that was impossible. I stayed close to Jake and Sarah this time, not wanting to be alone again. We were joking around, trying to shake off the creepy vibe, when I saw Ida's shadow moving behind one of the machines. It was quick, just a flicker, but it was too tall to be a rat or a trick of the light. I stopped dead, staring at the spot, and that's when I heard the footsteps again, heavier now, coming from the same direction. I grabbed Jake's arm and whispered, "You hear that?" He frowned, listened, and then his face went pale. Sarah heard it too. She didn't say anything, just pointed toward the machine where I'd seen the shadow. Something was there, and it was getting closer. We all froze, just standing there in that massive, decaying room, listening to those footsteps echo closer. They weren't rushed or frantic, just slow, steady, like whatever it was knew we weren't going anywhere. My light was shaking in my hand as I aimed it toward the machine, this huge rusted thing with pipes sticking out like twisted arms. The shadow moved again, slipping behind another piece of equipment, and I caught a glimpse of something long, tangled hair swaying as it ducked out of sight. My stomach flipped, and Sarah grabbed my sleeve, her nails digging in. Jake muttered, "What the hell was that?" But none of us had an answer. The humming got louder, vibrating through the floor, and I swear I felt it in my bones. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move, like the factory itself was holding me there. Then the footsteps stopped, and for a second it was dead silent, just that humming and our breathing. I thought maybe it was over, that whatever it was had backed off. But then this low, raspy laugh came from behind the machines, bouncing off the walls so I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It wasn't loud, but it cut through me like a knife rough, unhinged, like someone who'd been alone too long. Sarah whimpered, and Jake started backing up, pulling us with him. I kept my light on the spot where I'd last seen the shadow, and that's when he stepped out. A man tall, gaunt, with wild eyes and hair matted with dirt, stared right at us. His clothes were torn, hanging off him like rags, and his hands were clenched into fists. He didn't say anything, just grinned, this crooked, awful grin, and took a step toward us. That's when I knew we were in real trouble. I couldn't think straight, my brain just screamed run, but my body was slow to catch up. That guy's grin was burned into my head, like he was enjoying how scared we were. Sarah let out this choked sob, and Jake yelled, "Go, go!" We turned and booked it back toward the entrance, stumbling over junk on the floor. The footsteps started again behind us, fast this time, pounding the concrete like he was charging. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear him. His breathing was ragged, almost animal-like, getting louder every second. The factory felt alive then, like the walls were closing in, the shadows twisting around us. My light bounced everywhere as I ran, catching glimpses of rusted pipes and broken glass, but all I could focus on was getting out. We hit a narrow corridor, and I slammed into a metal door, fumbling with the handle. It wouldn't budge at first, and I could hear him closing in those heavy steps, that wheezing breath. Sarah was crying now, banging on the door with me, and Jake shoved his shoulder into it. It finally gave, screeching open, and we piled through, slamming it shut behind us. I leaned against it, panting, and felt the thud as something hit the other side hard. The door rattled but held, and for a second, I thought we'd made it. Then I heard that laugh again, muffled through the metal, and my blood ran cold. He was right there, just inches away. And I had this sick feeling he'd been watching us the whole time, waiting for us to split up, picking his moment. We didn't wait to find out what he'd do next. We just kept running. We sprinted through that last stretch of the factory, dodging overturned crates and ducking under low-hanging beams. The entrance was in sight, now this big, jagged hole where a door used to be, daylight spilling in like a lifeline. My lungs were burning and my legs felt like they'd give out, but I kept going, Jake and Sarah right beside me. The whole place was a blur of rust and decay, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the factory itself was pushing us out like it didn't want us there anymore. Or maybe it was done playing with us. That wheezing breath and those footsteps were still in my ears, even though I couldn't tell if he was still chasing us. Every shadow looked like him, Every creak sounded like that door about to burst open again. I just wanted out. We stumbled into the open air, tripping over the threshold and landing hard on the cracked pavement outside. I scrambled up, spinning around to look back at the entrance, half expecting that guy to come barreling out after us. But it was quiet, just the wind whistling through the broken windows and the distant hum of the highway. No footsteps, no laugh, nothing. Jake was doubled over, catching his breath, and Sarah was shaking, tears streaking her face. I kept staring at that dark hole we'd come from, waiting for something to happen. But it didn't. It was like the factory swallowed him up whole. Maybe he just stopped, satisfied with scaring us half to death. We didn't stick around to figure it out. We grabbed our stuff and hauled ass back to the car, peeling out of there like our lives depended on it. Driving away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, paranoid that I'd see him standing in the road or something. The factory shrank in the distance, just this hulking, ugly shape against the sky. But I couldn't shake the feeling it was still watching us. My hands were sweaty on the wheel, and none of us said much. Sarah was still sniffling, and Jake just stared out the window, his jaw tight. I think we were all replaying it in our heads, trying to make sense of what happened. That guy, those wild eyes, that granite, didn't feel human. Not completely. And the way the factory itself seemed to mess with us. With the doors and the shadows, it was like the place was alive, feeding off our fear. I don't know how else to explain it. When we got back to my place, we just sat there in the living room, still wired from it all. I tried to laugh it off, saying maybe he was just some homeless dude squatting there, but it didn't sound convincing even to me. Sarah pulled up her phone and showed us the pics. She'd taken most were blurry, just dark shapes and rust, but one made my stomach drop. It was from that big room with the machines, and in the corner, there was this faint outline, tall, hunched, barely there. Could have been a shadow, could have been nothing, but it looked too much like him. We didn't talk about it after that. We just deleted the pics and tried to move on. But I haven't slept right since. Every creak in my apartment makes me jump, and I keep wondering if he's still out there or if the factory's keeping him, waiting for someone else to wander in. It's been months now and I still can't get that day out of my head. I drive past the road to the factory, sometimes it's on my way to work, and every time, I feel this knot in my gut. I haven't gone back, and neither have Jake or Sarah. We don't even bring it up anymore. But I looked it up online once, just out of curiosity, and found some old articles about the place. It shut down in the 80s, after some workers went missing. Nothing concrete, just rumors about accidents and people vanishing on night shifts. There was one story from a local forum, though, about a guy who lived there after it closed. Some drifter who went nuts and started attacking trespassers. No one's seen him in years, they said. I don't know if it's the same guy, but it fits too well, and it makes me wonder what the hell we walked into. The weirdest part, it all just stopped. We got out, and that was it. No chase down the road, no creepy calls in the night, nothing. It's like the factory let us go, like it got what it wanted and was done with us. But I can't shake this feeling that it's not over, not really. I still hear that raspy laugh in my dreams, and sometimes I wake up thinking I smell that damp, rusty air. I don't know if it was just some psycho living there or something else, something tied to that place. All I know is I'm never stepping foot in another abandoned building again. If you guys ever go exploring, trust me, stay away from that factory. Whatever's in there, it's not worth finding out. Looking back, I keep kicking myself for not trusting my guts sooner. That first shuffle in the hallway, that door creaking open, I should have known something was wrong right then. But we were so caught up in the thrill of it, the whole urban exploring thing, that I ignored the signs. The factory wasn't just some cool, creepy spot to check out. It was like a trap, luring us in with its busted up machines and eerie quiet. I can still picture every detail, the way the light barely cut through the grime on the windows, the cold metal under my hands, the shadows that didn't make sense. It's like the place was waiting for us, sizing us up from the second we walked in. I don't know how to explain it without sounding nuts, but it felt personal, like it wanted us there. And that guy, whoever, or whatever he was, he's the part I can't let go of. Those eyes, man, they weren't right. They were too bright, too wild, like he wasn't all there, or maybe he was more than he should have been. I keep wondering if he was just some lunatic hiding out, or if the factory did something to him, twisted him up over years of being alone in there. The way he moved, the way he laughed, it didn't feel random. It felt like he'd been waiting, like he knew we'd come. I don't have answers, and that's what kills me. It happened, it scared the hell out of us, and then it was over, just like that. No explanation, no closure, just me, sitting here typing this. Still freaked out and wondering if I'll ever feel normal again. I've tried talking myself out of it, tried to convince myself it was just a bad day, just some weirdo messing with us. But the more I think about it, the less it adds up. That humming in the floor, the way the shadows moved, it wasn't normal. I've been in creepy places before, old houses and warehouses, but nothing ever felt like that. The factory had this energy, this weight, like it was alive and pissed off. I can still feel it sometimes, like a memory stuck in my skin, the cold, the damp, the way my chest tightened every time something moved. I don't know if it was haunted or cursed or what, but it wasn't just a building, it was something else, and we were dumb enough to walk right into it. The worst part is not knowing why it stopped. We got out, yeah, but why didn't he follow? Why didn't anything else happen? It's like the factory decided we weren't worth the trouble, or maybe it got what it wanted, scaring us senseless, and that was enough. I still see that grin in my head, hear that laugh, and it makes me sick. I've thought about going back, just to prove to myself it's over, but I can't do it. I'm too scared I'd find him there, waiting, or worse, nothing at all, like it never happened. So here I am, dumping this on you guys, hoping someone's got an answer. I don't know what we ran into that day, but it's still with me, and I don't think it's ever gonna let go. Story 3, The Church and the Silent Watcher. I'm posting this on a haunted house forum because I need to get it off my chest. It's been eating at me ever since that day. It happened during winter break my junior year of high school, back in late December. My best friend Jake and I were bored out of our minds, and somehow we got to talking about this old abandoned church at the end of Miller's Road. It's one of those places everyone in town knows about, but nobody messes with. People said it was creepy as hell, that you could feel something off just driving by. It had been empty for decades, swallowed up by trees and weeds, with a busted up fence barely holding together. Jake was all hyped up, saying we should check it out, and I was nervous, but didn't want to look like a wimp. So we grabbed our flashlights, threw on our coats, and headed out late in the afternoon, the sky already turning that dull gray you get in winter. By the time we got there, it was almost dark, and the place looked like it was waiting for us, silent, shadowy, and way too still. The church itself was this sagging wooden thing, paint peeling off in strips, windows either boarded up or cracked. The steeple was leaning a little, like it might fall any second, and the front steps creaked under our boots as we climbed up. I remember my stomach twisting as Jake pushed the door. It wasn't even locked, just swung open with this low groan that made my skin crawl. Inside, it was weirdly clean, not what I expected. No spray paint, no beer cans, just rows of dusty pews stretching back into the dark. The air was thick and cold, like it hadn't moved in years, and it smelled faintly of mildew and something sour I couldn't place. Our flashlights cut through the gloom, throwing shadows that danced on the walls, and I kept telling myself it was just an old building, nothing to freak out about. But then, maybe 10 minutes in, there was this loud thud like something heavy dropped right behind us. We spun around, hearts pounding, but there was nothing, just the empty pews staring back at us. I laughed it off, said it was probably a rat or something, but my hands were shaking as I gripped my flashlight tighter. After that thud, Jake and I kind of froze for a second, just staring at each other, trying to play it cool. He shrugged and said maybe the place was settling or whatever, but I could tell he was spooked, too. His voice was a little too loud, like he was forcing it. We kept moving, poking around near the front where there was this old podium, chipped and faded, still standing like it was waiting for a preacher who'd never show. I stepped up to it, just messing around, pretending to give a sermon, when I got this weird feeling like someone was watching me. I turned my flashlight toward the entrance, way at the back of the church, but it was too far, just a wall of black swallowing the beam. My chest tightened, and I couldn't shake the idea that something was there, just out of sight. Jake was already heading toward a little side room off the main aisle, calling me over, so I brushed it off and followed him. But that feeling stuck with me, heavy, like a hand on my shoulder I couldn't see. The side room was tiny, barely big enough for both of us, with a sagging table and some broken chairs stacked in the corner. There was this old hymn book on the table, pages yellowed and curling, and I swear the air in there felt even colder than the main room, like stepping into a fridge. Jake was shining his light around, pointing out spider webs in a cracked window. When we heard it, soft footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the aisle we'd just left. My heart stopped, and I grabbed his arm, whispering for him to shut up. We tiptoed to the door, which was half open, and peeked through the crack. That's when I saw it, a shadowy figure, tall and thin, moving down the aisle toward the entrance. It didn't make a sound after those footsteps, just glided silently, like it wasn't even touching the floor. My mouth went dry, and I could feel Jake trembling next to me. The figure reached the door, slipped outside, and was gone. No noise, no nothing. We just stood there, barely breathing, waiting for something else to happen. After that figure disappeared out the door, Jake and I didn't move for what felt like forever. My legs were locked up, and my flashlight was shaking in my hand, throwing jittery light all over the walls. I kept waiting to hear something, footsteps outside, a car starting. Anything but. It was dead quiet, just the wind rattling the loose boards on the church. Jake whispered, "What the hell was that?" And I couldn't even answer. My throat was so tight. We both knew we'd seen the same thing, but saying it out loud felt like it'd make it worse. I wanted to bolt right then, but we were still in that side room, and the idea of crossing the open aisle to get out made my stomach churn. What if it came back? What if it was still out there, waiting? I could still feel that weight on me, like eyes boring into my back, even though we were alone now, or at least I hoped we were. Finally, Jake grabbed my sleeve and said we had to go, that we couldn't just stand there all night. I nodded, but every step toward the door felt like wading through mud. We crept out of the side room, flashlights darting around, and the pews looked different now, like they were leaning in, watching us. My beam caught something on the floor near the podium, a single footprint in the dust, long and narrow, barefoot, like someone had stood there and then walked off. I hadn't seen it before, and I know Jake didn't either, because he sucked in a breath and muttered, "No way." My mind was racing. Had that been there the whole time? Was it from that thing we saw? I couldn't stop picturing it standing at the podium, staring at me while I'd been goofing around earlier. The church felt alive now, like it was holding its breath, and all I wanted was to get the hell out before it decided to do something worse. Seeing that footprint messed me up bad. I kept staring at it, my flashlight locked on it, and Jake had to yank me toward the aisle to snap me out of it. We started moving faster, not running yet, but close, our boots thumping loud against the old floorboards. Every creak and groan from the church sounded like it was answering us, like the place didn't want us to leave. I kept my light on the entrance ahead, that black rectangle where the figure had gone, half expecting it to step back in and block us. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my ears, and my breath was coming out in shaky puffs you could see in the cold. Jake was right beside me, muttering curses under his breath, and I could tell he was just as freaked. The closer we got to the door, the heavier that watched feeling got, like whatever had been here wasn't done with us yet. When we hit the entrance, I tripped over the threshold and nearly ate it on the steps outside. Jake grabbed my arm and hauled me up, and we didn't stop, just booked it down those rickety stairs and into the overgrown yard. The cold air hit my face like a slap, but it didn't shake off the panic. I kept looking back at the church, its dark shape looming against the gray sky, and I swear I saw something move in one of the cracked windows, a quick flicker, gone before I could focus. My chest was burning, and my legs felt like jelly, but we didn't slow down until we hit the road. Only then did we stop, gasping, staring back at that place. The silence was suffocating. No birds, no wind, just the church sitting there like it was daring us to come back. And that's when it hit me. Whoever or whatever that figure was, it had been in there with us the whole time, watching, waiting, before it decided to walk away. Standing there on the road, catching my breath, I couldn't stop replaying it all in my head. That figure, those footsteps, the footprint, it didn't add up, but it felt so real, I couldn't deny it. Jake was pacing, hands on his head, saying over and over that we were idiots for going in there. I just nodded, still staring at the church, its outline barely visible now in the dark. My flashlight was still on, but the battery was dying, flickering weak light across the gravel. I kept thinking about how untouched the inside was, no trash, no signs of kids messing around. It was like the place didn't want anyone else in there, like it was guarding something, and us, we'd walked right into it. My skin was still crawling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd gotten off easy, that whatever was in there let us go. We started walking back toward town, sticking close together, neither of us saying much. The road was empty, just us and the sound of our boots crunching on the frost. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure trailing behind us. But it was just the trees and the dark. My mind wouldn't quit. I kept picturing it standing at the entrance, watching us leave, or maybe it was still inside, pacing those pews. Jake finally broke the silence, asking if I thought it was a ghost or some creep living there. I didn't have an answer. Both ideas scared the crap out of me. All I knew was that church wasn't normal. It felt alive, like it had its own heartbeat, and we'd stumbled into its game. By the time we got home, I was exhausted, but sleep wasn't happening, not with that place burned into my brain. When I got back to my room that night, I just sat on my bed, staring at the wall, still wired from it all. My coat was still on, muddy from the yard, and my flashlight was dead on the floor where I dropped it. I kept running through every second in that church, the thud, the footsteps, that figure slipping out the door. It didn't feel like some random homeless guy crashing there. It was too quiet, too deliberate. I couldn't stop wondering why it didn't come after us, why it just left. My hands were still shaky, and I kept rubbing them on my jeans, trying to calm down. I even thought about texting Jake to see if he was okay, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. That church, though, it was like it had marked me somehow, like I'd carry it with me no matter where I went. The worst part hit me later, when I was lying there in the dark, trying to sleep. I realized we never heard that figure come in. We'd been in there a while before the footsteps started, which meant it was already inside when we showed up. It could have been standing in that black patch by the entrance the whole time, watching me at the podium, listening to us laugh and mess around. My stomach dropped thinking about it, how close we'd been to something we didn't understand. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, but it didn't help. I kept imagining its eyes on me, unblinking, waiting for the right moment to move. That church wasn't just abandoned, it was hiding something, and we'd walked right into its trap. Even now, months later, I can't drive by Miller's Road without feeling sick. Whatever was in there, it saw us, and I don't think it's done with us yet. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept, and all my head was foggy, and my body ached like I'd run a marathon. I kept seeing that footprint in my mind, clear as day, and it made me queasy just thinking about it. I met up with Jake at the diner in town, and he looked rough, 2 bags under his eyes, quieter than usual. We didn't talk much about it at first, just sipped our coffee and stared out the window, but I could tell it was on his mind too. Finally, he leaned in and said he'd had a nightmare about the church, something about the pews moving on their own. I didn't tell him, but I dreamed about that figure too, standing in my room, silent, just watching. It felt so real I'd woken up sweating, checking the corners of my room. That place had gotten under our skin, and we both knew it wasn't just some dumb scare anymore. We tried to figure it out, tossing around ideas about what we'd seen. Jake thought maybe it was some old preacher's ghost, tied to the church. But I wasn't so sure. It didn't feel angry or sad, just there. I kept going back to how the church looked inside, so untouched, like time hadn't moved in there. It wasn't normal, and neither was that figure. I remembered the way it moved, smooth to smooth, like it didn't belong in a body. My coffee went cold while we sat there, and I couldn't shake this nagging thought. What if it wasn't stuck there? What if it followed us out? I didn't say it out loud. Jake was already on edge, but the idea stuck with me. That church wasn't just a building, it was a cage for something, and we'd opened the door. I still don't know what it wanted, but I know it saw us, and that's enough to keep me up at night. After that diner talk, Jake and I made a pact not to go back to the church ever. It wasn't even a question. We were done with that place, but it didn't feel like it was done with us. For days after, I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that figure in the corner of my eye, just standing there. Nothing ever showed up, but the feeling wouldn't go away, like I was being sized up by something I couldn't see. I started avoiding Miller's Road altogether, taking the long way to school even if it made me late. My mom asked why I was acting so jumpy, but I just shrugged it off. How do you explain something like that without sounding nuts? The church was still out there, rotting away, and I couldn't stop wondering if it was waiting for someone else to stumble in. One night, maybe a week later, I was home alone, scrolling on my phone, when the power flickered. It was just for a second, but my heart jumped into my throat, and I sat up straight, listening. The house was quiet, but I couldn't relax. Every little noise sounded like those footsteps from the church. I got up, checked the locks, peeked out the windows, but it was just the usual winter night outside. Still, I couldn't shake it. I kept picturing that figure slipping through my yard, silent as it had been in the aisle, watching me through the glass. I turned on every light in the house and sat there, wide awake, until the sun came up. It was stupid, I know nothing happened, but that church had me paranoid. It's like it planted something in me, a fear I can't shake, and I don't know if I'll ever feel normal again. A few weeks passed, and I tried to convince myself that it was over, that whatever had happened in that church was in the past. But then, little things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something was standing in the corner of my room, just beyond the reach of my vision. My closet door, which I always kept shut, would be open in the morning. Once, I swore I heard soft footsteps in the hallway while I was home alone. The same slow, deliberate steps from that church aisle. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was letting fear get the best of me. But deep down, I knew EA hadn't left that church alone. One night, I had the worst nightmare of my life. I was back in the church, standing at the podium. But this time, the pews weren't empty. Dozens of figures sat in silence, their faces blurred, their heads slightly tilted as if they were listening. The air was thick, suffocating, and I couldn't move. Then, the front doors creaked open, and that same shadowy figure from before stepped inside, gliding down the aisle toward me. But just before it reached me, I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. The worst part, my bedroom door, which I always locked, was wide open. I never told Jake about the dreams or the strange things happening in my house. We had already agreed to never talk about that place again, and I wasn't about to break that pact. But sometimes, I wonder if he experienced the same things, if the church had followed him too. I don't go near Miller's Road anymore, and I sure as hell don't look at that church. But I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching, still waiting. And the scariest part, I don't think it ever wanted us to leave. I think it let us go for now.